know the business of the Senate needs to proceed. Mr. President, I'm proud to be joining forces with my colleague from Oklahoma, Dr. Coburn, to insist that we stop burdening our children and our grandchildren with massive debt. We have before us today a supplemental appropriations bill totaling nearly $60 billion, most of it not paid for, simply being added to the ever-growing deficit to be paid for by future generations of Americans. If we're serious about our commitment to reduce our debt and eliminate our deficit, then Congress needs to start making some tough decisions about our national priorities, and we need to start now. What Dr. Coburn's amendment is seeking is a vote on one of two reasonable amendments, both of which would fully offset the cost of this bill. Yesterday, Dr. Coburn very eloquently laid out his reasons for offering these two amendments. Essentially, our fiscal situation is extremely perilous. We can no longer afford to approve any new federal funding without eliminating wasteful and unnecessary spending in other areas. You know, kind of a bizarre thing happened yesterday. In the middle of his speech and his argument before the Senate, Dr. Coburn yielded the floor to the majority leader, who proceeded to file cloture on the bill after only one day of floor consideration and not a single vote on any amendment. So on a $60 billion appropriation, most of it not paid for, we are now going to, and without a single amendment having been voted on, we will now be voting on a bill, in fact, that it will not be paid for. As my colleagues know quite well, the editorial page of the Washington Post is by no means a conservative, right-leaning, penny-pinching bunch. But even they are perplexed about what we're doing here. Yesterday, in an editorial entitled, "Congress as Usual, There's an Election Coming, Time to Spend," the Post wrote, quote, "All across the Western world, fiscal stimulus is starting to give way to fiscal consolidation. In London, the new British government has announced an $8.6 billion in immediate budget cuts. In Paris, French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been negotiating to raise the country's retirement age. In Madrid, Spanish civil servants are facing a 5% pay cut, followed by a wage freeze. Even Italy is talking about tightening spending, and don't get us started on Greece. Only in Washington, it seems," the editorial went on to say, "is a long-awaited pivot to fiscal restraint nowhere to be seen. As the midterm elections draw near, Congress is considering a passel of new spending, necessary and otherwise, most of which won't be paid for." Sadly, the Washington Post hit the nail on the head, and the bill before us is the perfect example of Congress's inability to deal with the very serious fiscal realities that are facing this nation. Under the supplemental, DOD receives $33.7 billion for operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Haiti. The bulk of the money, $24.6 billion, is for operations and maintenance and much-needed other funding. The remainder of the DOD funding is for military personnel costs and other equipment. Some say a fiscally responsible way to pay for our war costs is to increase taxes. We disagree. The American people, particularly our soldiers and families, are sacrificing enough already. It's time for Congress to start making some sacrifices and forgo the earmarks and other special deals to help provide our troops with the support and equipment they need. The First Amendment of Dr. Coburn's saves taxpayers $59.6 billion by doing the following: freezing raises, bonuses, and salary increases for federal employees for 1 year, collecting unpaid taxes from federal employees, $3 billion, reduce printing and publishing costs of the government documents, $4.4 billion over 10 years, reducing excessive duplication, overhead, and spending within the federal government, $20 billion, eliminating non-essential government travel, $10 billion over 10 years, eliminating bonuses for poor performance by government contractors, $8 billion over 10 years, repealing the Energy Star program, $627 million over 10 years, eliminating increase in foreign aid for international organizations, $68 million, limiting voluntary payments to the United Nations, $10 billion over 10 years, striking unnecessary appropriations for salaries and expenses of a government commission Congress ignored, The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, $1.8 million. We're sending a State Department training facility that was not requested by the community, where it is to be constructed, $500 million. In the Second Amendment, we can save the taxpayers $60 billion by cutting budgets of members of Congress, by disposing of unneeded, unused government property, auctioning and selling unused and unneeded equipment, rescinding unspent and uncommitted federal funds. So we have ways we can cut spending. We have ways we can reduce the government in the First Amendment by nearly $60 billion, and the other one by $60 billion. In a letter to Speaker Pelosi in April of last year, President Obama wrote, and I quote from the letter he wrote last year, quote, "As I noted when I first introduced my budget in February, this is the last planned war supplemental. Since September 2001, the Congress has passed 17 separate emergency funding bills totaling $822.1 billion for the wars in Iran and Afghanistan. After 7 years of war, the American people deserve an honest accounting for the cost of our involvement in our ongoing military operations." Quote, I quote from the President's letter of last April a year ago. "We must break that recent tradition and include future military costs in the regular budget so that we have an honest, more accurate, and fiscally responsible estimate of federal spending. And we should not label military costs as emergency funds so as to avoid our responsibility to abide by the spending limits set forth by the Congress." And the President emphasized, and again I quote from the President's letter to the Speaker of the House, "After years of budget gimmicks and wasteful spending, it's time to end the era of irresponsibility in Washington." I could not agree more, and that's why I'm disappointed to see yet another supplemental spending bill designated as an emergency without offsets. Dr. Coburn and I agree with what the President said last year. After years of budget gimmicks and wasteful spending, it's time to end the era of irresponsibility in Washington, and that's precisely what we're seeking to do with these two amendments. The past 2 years, America has faced her greatest fiscal challenges since the Great Depression. When the financial markets collapsed, it was the American taxpayer who came to the rescue of the banks and the big Wall Street firms. But who's come to the rescue of the American taxpayer? Certainly not Congress. So what has Congress done? By enacting inexplicable policies that can only be described as generational theft, we've saddled future generations with literally trillions of dollars of debt. Since January of 2009, we've been on a spending binge the likes of which this nation has never seen. In that time, our debt has grown by over $2 trillion. We passed a $1.1 trillion, quote, stimulus bill, remembering the assurance that unemployment would be at a maximum of 8%. Now it's 9.9. We passed a $2.5 trillion health care bill. American people are still very angry about that. The President submitted a budget for next year totaling $3.8 trillion. We now have a deficit of over $1.4 trillion, and we just passed a week or so ago the $13 trillion debt mark. We now have a deficit of over $1.4 trillion. As I mentioned, that amounts, the $13 trillion debt amounts to more than $42,000 owed by every man, woman, and child in America. This year, the government will spend more than $3.6 trillion and will borrow 41 cents for every dollar it spends. Unemployment remains at 9.9%, and according to Forge.com, a record 2.8 million American households were threatened with foreclosure last year, and that number is expected to rise to well over 3 million homes this year. And now with this bill, we're poised to tack another $60 billion onto the tab. Mr. President, I travel a lot around my state. I know a lot of our members do, or all of our members do. Every place I go, I meet county supervisors, city councilmen, mayors, elected officials all over my state, talk to the governor, the legislature. They make tough decisions. The city of Phoenix had to cut its budget by some 30% last year. Very tough decisions. Meanwhile, we increased domestic spending by 20%. What's the difference between the city of Phoenix and us here in the Capitol? We print money. We print money. A debt of $1.4 trillion this year, estimated to be $1.5 trillion this year. How can we continue this? This amendment, these two amendments by Dr. Coburn, can achieve a significant savings, $60 billion in each. That's $120 billion that both of these amendments could save the taxpayers. Wouldn't it be wonderful to show the taxpayers that maybe we're going to do something like cutting the budget, cutting our budgets? Wouldn't it be nice to tell the American people that we're going to eliminate non-essential government travel? Couldn't we at least freeze bonuses? Couldn't we at least freeze that? So we have an opportunity here to show the American people that we're going to tighten our belts a little bit too, that we care about generational theft that we're committing, that we care about future generations of Americans. I know that some of these measures wouldn't be popular, but Dr. Coburn has never been one who has tried to win a popularity contest here. What Dr. Coburn has tried to do is steer the American people on a path to some kind of fiscal solvency so that we can stop this terrible generational theft that we are committing. I will end with this thought, Mr. President. You know, the greatness of America, certainly one of the greatest attributes of America, is that we have handed on to every generation of Americans a better one than the one that they had before them. And that's been the great and wonder and beauty of America. With these kinds of debts and deficits, how can we pass on? How can we pass on to our children and our grandchildren? So I applaud Senator Coburn not only for this effort, but many of the other efforts that he's made. I'm pleased to join him. I hope my colleagues will understand that the American people are really angry and they're really frustrated. Look at the latest polling numbers, and we do read polls. Do you want to re-elect your member of Congress? What is our approval ratings? 14, 13, 12%? We're down to blood relatives and paid staffers. So the point is that let's send a message to the American people that we're serious. And yes, there are tough decisions and tough things that have to be, that are embodied in this legislation. I urge my colleagues to at least take a look at it and consider putting this Congress and this nation on a different path. I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I rise today to voice my support for H.R. 4899, the FY 2010